I don't want to use an unparliamentary expression, but I think I can borrow it, the terminological inexactitude of Mr. Edward Heath, who told us that joining the common market would entail no loss
of essential national sovereignty. Then a decade or so later, he brazenly admitted that this was a project that was always about greater political as well as economic union.
If you live in the United Kingdom, you have probably heard this phrase. And if you haven't heard it, you have probably read it in one of the newspapers or on one of the news sites. This is the story of no loss of essential national sovereignty. Chapter 1. The Kilmuir Letter.
And Ted's mistake was to ignore the advice that he had received from Harold Macmillan's Lord Chancellor, Lord Kilmuir, to come clean with the British people about the full implications of membership for sovereignty, Parliament, the courts, and so forth.
Here is a reasonably standard example of how no loss of essential national sovereignty has been covered in the media. This article appeared in Prospect magazine in October 2006 and was written by the journalist John Lloyd. John argues that to secure membership, Heath suppressed, as far as he could, the desire of European states to move to an ever closer union. He claims Heath consistently described the community as a trading agreement and assured Parliament that there was no question of Britain losing essential national sovereignty. John also writes that one of Heath's advisers said that the policy was governed by the rule, "Don't talk about this in public." And while Edward Heath proceeded by stealth, we are told, the political opposition, press, and the media didn't make a political issue. The way that this has been presented, you might be forgiven in believing that the political nature of the common market was a closely guarded secret, that it was being suppressed by Edward Heath and some European Illuminati. But as you can see, that's just not the case. And in 1959, its first political moves happen, and many people believe it's going to be a full United States of Europe by the end of the 1960s. The political intentions of the common market are no longer just public domain, they are current affairs. Current affairs in Britain were covered by a programme called Panorama. 9 million people would regularly tune in at 8:30 on a Monday. It was so influential that politicians started to argue it should be regulated in the spring of 1960. And it was in the spring of 1960 that Jean Monnet went on Panorama and, in the words of Major Harry Legg Burke, made quite clear that the principal objective of the Common Market project is political union in Europe. I can't tell you exactly what Monet said, but there were just 2 television channels in 1960, and by the end of the month, ITN Roving Report also ran a programme on the Common Market, and you can hear some of that for yourself.
These countries are now not only pooling their economies, but also moving towards political unity, and Britain has refused to join. From the wreckage of war, de Gaulle and Adenauer built up an alliance based on mutual need. The dream of Adenauer, as of many European politicians, is a United States of Europe, a single nation on the scale of America and Russia. But Britain refused to join.
And before the government announced their interest in membership, there is also a campaign to join. And the political nature isn't missing from that campaign. But this video isn't about the wider discussion, it's about Edward Heath, who in 1960 was tasked with investigating possible implementations of this government policy.
They will work towards the political and economic unity of Western Europe on a basis satisfactory to all the governments concerned.
In December of 1960, Heath received a letter from the then Lord Chancellor, the so-called Kilmuir Letter.
Well before these reassuring statements were made, Mr. Heath received this letter from Britain's then Lord Chancellor, the head of our judiciary. It spelled out in black and white that the surrenders of sovereignty are serious ones and ought to be brought out in the open now. But Mr. Heath and his colleagues chose not to bring these vital facts out in the open. Instead, they hid them from the British public.
In this letter, Lord Kilmuir laid out what he said were the constitutional implications of the Treaty of Rome, that we would have to accept regulations into our law, even ones we had voted against, that we transfer treaty power to the community and may have to accept treaties when overruled in the Council. The House of Lords would have to refer questions to the court and accept the decisions. He goes on to say, the first 2 are the most important ones, and these objections ought to be brought out now. He concludes the letter saying it is his concern that we see exactly what it is that we are being called to sacrifice and how serious our loss would be. The government were going to be seeking serious derogations from the treaty. Lord Kilmuir didn't want to give those opposed to joining a reason to call foul when the results of that negotiation was brought back, or worse still, when the legislation was going through Parliament. And Lord Kilmuir was right. Being overruled in the Council was going to become an issue.
One of the crucial points in the common market system. The chances of one member, Britain for instance, being outvoted and overruled by the others.
However, as Money explained to Edward Heath, there was a political element to voting in the Council.
When I first was asked by Mr. Macmillan to start exploring the possibilities, I went and talked to John Money, and we went over the whole field. And he said, you people in Britain, you've always been worried about sovereignty. Now, I must tell you this, that if one of the members of the community has something which it regards as vital, the others are not going to overrule it. And why? Because they know it would break up the community. And they don't want to break up the community, because all the other benefits are so great.
There was not just one letter. When the full Cabinet were informed that the UK were going to investigate joining the Common Market, in April 1961, there was a whole Kilmuir report on sovereignty. The introduction made clear that there was a political objective that was to be brought about by gradual surrender of sovereignty. The Continental opinion would not think the UK was applying in earnest, it said, if they were not prepared to abandon a significant degree of sovereignty. But crucially, it did not say that the UK must be prepared to abandon all of its sovereignty. The report also contained all the elements of Kilmuir's letter. The Cabinet notes refer to these issues and conclude a big campaign was going to be needed to win acceptance. Edward Heath kicked off the debate on the 17th of May by asking Parliament if they supported their foreign policy goals, including considering common market membership. He explained that the common market was political and was becoming more political. William Warby would conclude that Edward Heath had made it clear that the government wanted to join a closer political association, and he wasn't prepared to have foreign policy dictated to him by Adenauer and de Gaulle. Edward Heath would also say they had been examining the institutions, and this ought to be faced frankly. He went on to say that the operations of the community affect two particular aspects of national sovereignty, and that there should be no misunderstanding what is involved, that the power to make commercial agreements passes to the Commission, and the appeal from commercial decisions lies to the International Court. He underlined the seriousness by saying it is only right that these two things be mentioned. They are both important and we should face them frankly and openly. With two sentences in the very first debate, Edward Heath brought out two serious losses of sovereignty that in Britain, we are told, were kept secret. The simple fact was, Lord Kilmuir had got his information from reading the treaty, and the government made their translation of the Treaty of Rome available to Parliament, so they too could come to those conclusions. At this point, things were happening in Europe that would make it very hard to present the common market as just an economic venture. The Chancellor of Germany, Adenauer, did not believe Macmillan was going to decide to join. In a firm statement to an American ambassador, he said, "No, Macmillan will never join in any serious moves towards European unity. Heath might wish to, and several ministers. Selwyn Lloyd, I believe, has been converted, but the Macmillan government will never make the necessary decision." Adenauer would convince de Gaulle that Macmillan wasn't going to join, and they should make a start on political union. This leads to the Bonn Declaration. It states new members should assume the same responsibilities of the existing members and calls for a treaty of political union. If Macmillan decides to join, this declaration is effectively saying they expect him to sign a treaty that hasn't been written yet. And Macmillan does decide to join. The Cabinet conclude that the wider political and even moral aspects should not be neglected, and that membership might be held out as a step towards a union of the free world. Then, days before the official announcement, the Cabinet was informed that a motion had been put forward. It expressed opposition to any material derogation of British sovereignty. The government's response was to alter the motion to say they would not conclude any agreement concerning the UK's special interests or involving sovereignty without Parliament's express approval. In short, they are offering full transparency to Parliament. On the day of the announcement, the Daily Mirror, the most read newspaper in the country, proclaims on the front page that one of the ultimate aims of the common market is to create some form of political as well as economic federation, a sort of United States of Europe. The second most read newspaper in 1961 was against joining. And you can find a reference to the United States of Europe on page 6, under a reference to losing the Commonwealth and under the economics. The political gains, it asks. The so-called United States of Europe has no attraction for the British people It goes on to say, yet far stronger than the economic and political arguments against the common market, overwhelming though these are, is the conviction of the people that to join Europe and sacrifice the empire would be to betray the whole life and purpose of the British nation. It's important to remember then that the announcement is not the beginning of the debate. A question mark had hung over UK membership for months, and in that time the press coverage intensified. This is no longer something happening to other people. Politicians and people at the time seemed to regard this as the period when people became fully aware, when people found out what common market meant. During this period, one of the BBC's European experts, William Pickles, wrote, "Over and over again, the European advocates of the common market have warned us that their purposes were political and that we were wanted only if we accepted these political purposes." Going on to say, people are waking up now because they have suddenly begun to fear that talk may give way to action, that the government may actually be thinking of going in. He goes on to talk about the vetoes and the majority voting, before saying the only important fields of policy in which member countries will be free, in theory, to act in their own way will be those of education, defence and foreign affairs, before suggesting that de Gaulle wants foreign affairs and defence too. He then states that he believed in 10 or less years the common market countries will be forced into some kind of United States of Europe, and at that point Britain would disappear and become a mere member state of a federation with no more influence in world affairs than the states of New York or New South Wales. And while the public are going through this political awakening, the Prime Minister is beginning to develop a reputation among the opposition of concentrating only on the economics. And on that note, let's get to Macmillan's opening statement. This is a political as well as an economic issue. Although the Treaty of Rome is concerned with economic matters, it has an important political objective, namely, to promote unity and stability in Europe, which is so essential a factor in the struggle for freedom and progress throughout the world. In this modern world, the tendency towards large groups of nations acting together in the common interests leads to greater unity, and thus adds to our strength in the struggle for freedom. On the next day, the government lay their motion on sovereignty. Their presentation has two strands. The first strand is about sovereignty in the treaty itself. In his opening speech, the Prime Minister said, "These apprehensions about the social implications of joining the treaty are really aspects of a wider constitutional anxiety about what has often been called sovereignty. I must remind the House that the E.E.C. is an economic community, not a defence alliance or a foreign policy community or a cultural community. It is an economic community, and the region where the collective decisions are taken is related to the sphere covered by the treaty, economic tariffs, markets, and all the rest." The second strand covered the political sovereignty to come. Macmillan would refer to people who wanted full federation, but say he could only see a confederation working, a commonwealth, if you like to call it, which would retain the great traditions while working together in a clearly defined sphere for their common interest. A concept more in tune with national traditions, one which the UK could associate willingly and wholeheartedly. But, he warned, unless we could bring our influence to bear, we should not be able to play our part in deciding the future structure of Europe. There was nothing on the constitutional side we needed to fear and could not resolve. As the Prime Minister was laying out the government case, a debate was being held in the House of Lords at the same time. In it, the Foreign Minister would state that the treaty involved considerable derogations of sovereignty, and then goes on to say, derogations of sovereignty will be different in kind from any contract which we have entered before. But the sovereignty debate doesn't really start until the second day. That is the day that Lord Kilmuir presents the effects to Parliament, the loss of treaty-making power, and the loss of independence to the court. So having covered all his concerns from his letter, he then goes to the government strands. Firstly, he made it clear that these unprecedented derogations of sovereignty were related only to fulfilling Article 2 and 3 of the Treaty of Rome, that extensions of power must come from a unanimous vote. And while some may have heard that majority voting is to replace unanimous votes in the future, on this point the vote will remain unanimous. On the political strand, he states that it had been a leading factor in the decision to ask for negotiations, that signing the Treaty of Rome does not commit any country to ultimate federation. It does, however, imply the signatories will work to draw ever closer to each other in the political field. In the House of Commons, Edward Heath also covers the two sovereignty strands, where he too raised the issue of majority voting covering Articles 2 and 3. In a way, only a mother could love. He just isn't very good at this point. He is, however, diligent, replying to questions about sovereignty that have been raised over the last few days. When it comes to the political strand, Edward Heath is so much better. He broke this down to 3 different parts, including the possibility of future constitutional developments, which he says could be on the lines of federalism, confederalism, or some other sphere. He then makes the same point as Lord Kilmuir. We are not signing up to a particular constitutional view. No one can tell the future. There are widely divergent views on this. We will be able to influence the development, and any extension of powers requires unanimous consent. Edward Heath would barely refer to the actual negotiation, spending most of his time talking about this sovereignty issue. During the debates, we also learned from Quentin Hogg that information about sovereignty is not restricted to Parliament. The Conservative Central Office has apparently published something covering sovereignty to the wider public. And the sovereignty issue does not stop there. It will come up at the Conservative conference. Andrew Bowden, in laying down a motion to support the negotiations, said, "We have to make sacrifices of sovereignty for some form of unity. If the free world is to survive, then it must unite, politically, militarily, and economically." Garrett Walker-Smith, the most prominent Conservative opponent of entry, states we are losing sovereignty on tariffs and immigration, and we cannot withdraw. The common market is forever. What happens, he asks, if in 5, 10, 15 years they move to political union? Would we be able to stay as an economic member? Heath would respond to this point. Alone, the 6 may make political decisions that would vitally affect the UK. It needs to be part of these councils. If we had wanted an economic agreement, we would have applied for an association. I am not, he said, one of those who has an inferiority complex about our ability to influence the community when we play our full part in it. Our voice will be heard and welcomed. He concludes, "Let us not be frightened of this. Let us take part and expect to play our full share in future developments. In the government, we feel that this is a constructive, forward-looking policy of the greatest importance, not only for ourselves, but also for the future of Europe and the free world. We are about to begin these negotiations. Let us go into them with your backing to achieve success." And at that he sat down and was given round after round of applause. When Macmillan spoke at the conference about the common market, he talks about peace, standing up to communism, common strength for the greatest common challenge. He talks about economics, although not in the way some might expect. His fundamental argument for joining is not economic, it is geopolitical. But unlike Heath, he would not refer to any future political developments. Certainly nothing to silence his critics on the way he is presenting this. Edward Heath, however, as we see in this manufacturing lunch, had a different presentational style. He explained that the common market had no control over home, foreign and defence policy, but we would put into the common pool a certain amount of sovereignty. It would be a very bold person, he said, who tried to foretell what the organisation of Europe is going to be in 10, 25 or 50 years' time. The Treaty of Rome would have to be changed or replaced if there were a closer European political union in the future. Any country is in a position to stop that development if it wishes, but we would wish to play our full part in that development. 1 week after that lunch, Heath would open up the negotiations. In his speech, he referred to the progress the 6 had made towards greater unity in areas outside of the treaties, and that the government fully share the aims and objectives, political and otherwise, of the Bonn Declaration. Going on to say, the more that we, the United Kingdom, can contribute to the unifying process of this great European community, the more we shall feel that we are joining the historic enterprise the genius of the European peoples has launched. He then broaches the suspicions in Europe that the UK is joining to slow down the development, saying, "I do not imagine any of us know what form the community will take in 15 or 20 years' time, but he was convinced that our membership will not mean slowing down this process, but a continued advance and development of closer unity." And with that speech, Edward Heath became the first minister to put on the record the UK's intention to commit to the future political union.
The United Kingdom government wished to take its full part in working together for a closer European unity.
Then, on April the 10th, 1962, Edward Heath gave a speech covering the government's entire position on this political union, not just asking to join the current negotiation, but explaining how the UK government saw things like defence policy working. With full transparency on political union, it was now time for full transparency on the constitutional changes required by the treaty. At the beginning of May 1962, Norman Pentland asked Edward Heath for a white paper that clarified the constitutional implications. This wasn't the first time a white paper had been asked for in this subject. It wasn't even the first time Norman Pentland had asked for one. But Edward Heath became the first person from the government to commit to deliver one, replying that the government was required to do this by their original resolution. And in 1962, a subcommittee is set up to write a white paper breaking down all the constitutional implications. At the beginning of June, Edward Heath asks if they can be involved in the negotiation of the political union again. But the Bonn Declaration is old news, and unlike Macmillan, Heath was never accused of downplaying the political developments at this time. But it is the beginning of June we do find something new. When Edward Heath first brought out the second and third point in the Kilmuir letter, his description was legally unsophisticated at best. When he debated the sovereignty of the treaty during the July debates, he was like a fish out of water. But it is at this time we find him discussing the first point in Kilmuir's letter, the one point he didn't bring out at the beginning. This is not the first time he had addressed it, but he'd never done it like this before. Yes, of course, regulations have the force of law, he said, and then broke down their plans for the existing regulations, the method of creating regulations, the voting procedure, and the European Parliament's involvement. This is not the Edward Heath of July 1961. It could be argued that this is a more concise description than the one Lord Kilmuir made, either to Parliament or in his letter. And let us remember, in that letter, the Lord Chancellor said he wanted these things brought out into the open now. Since Cabinet don't know they're actually looking at it, it seems unlikely he means that literally, but he obviously wanted it out as early as possible. In a discussion with an American diplomat on the 18th of May, Heath described his speech in the Commons on May the 17th as opening gun in grand debate, and that it represented the beginning of a campaign to educate the Conservative Party and the country generally about issues involved in the UK moving into the common market. And if the campaign to educate the public was on the 17th of May, then that is where we should find these issues. And that is where we do find those issues. The letter also says, if we attempt to gloss over them. And it is my concern to ensure that we should see what we are surrendering. So why did anyone assume that Lord Kilmuir himself wasn't going to be doing this? He is the Lord Chancellor. It is his job. And while it's true that Edward Heath isn't as good as the Chancellor in laying out the sovereignty, or that Macmillan isn't as good as Edward Heath when it comes to the political side, but within the first year, the Macmillan government had produced what would probably become the most comprehensive breakdown of the government's thinking on political union ever laid before Parliament. And they had promised a white paper on the constitutional and legal implications, which they were working on with eminent lawyers. A white paper which would have been published for Parliament and the public before the government entered into any agreement. However, even before that was published, it's clear that these Kilmuir issues have been brought out into the open, with two being brought out on day one of the government's campaign. A campaign which has seen Edward Heath talk about constitutional sovereignty, political sovereignty, sovereignty with regard to majority voting in the treaty, and sovereignty with regard to the practical workings of the community. So when John Lloyd wrote that it depends heavily on what is meant by essential, the first question really should have been, what is the context of this sentence? And that's the end of this video. Thanks very much for watching. And in this chapter, we saw Eurosceptics asking for no loss of material sovereignty. In the next chapter, we will see Macmillan reassuring the public there will be no loss of any sovereignty in the true sense of the word. What did he mean by that? You'll have to watch to find out.